Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. And on this channel, we have already talked about some key examples in the work of Hans Holbein the Younger. I will, of course, be linking any and all relevant videos in my description box. And yet, there is, I think, one very famous subject that is still missing, namely Holbein's own royal patron. But before we take a look at today's topic, I want to say an absolutely massive thank you to History Hit for sponsoring another video on this channel. And for those of you who watch the history news updates over here on Reading the Past, I'm sure you are aware that we do often find ourselves looking at stories about Pompeii. And so you can imagine my glee when I saw this programme about some of the people who actually lived there.
The surviving archaeology has preserved Pompeii in its final moments. But it's also revealed so much about life before the eruption, extraordinary glimpses into the world of the people who dwelled here. From wealthy villa owners, like the entrepreneurial businesswoman Julia Felix, to lowly men like Marcus Attilius, who fought and bled for the pleasure of others. Walking in their footsteps, I'll be exploring some of the most remarkable structures and meeting leading experts to better understand who these people were that made up this breathtaking town. This is the story of the people who called Pompeii home.
I loved this documentary and I know that you will too. History Hit brings you the stories that shape the world through their award-winning online history channel and podcast network. It's like Netflix, but it's all history. Watch hundreds of hours of original history documentaries anywhere, anytime, on any device. Brought to you by expert historians such as Dan Snow, Professor Susanna Lipscomb, Dan Jones, and more. And as well as already having hundreds of expert-led programmes, they add 2 more every week. Click the link in my description box to find out more and to subscribe to History Hit. As an added bonus, History Hit are offering my viewers a very special discount. If you use the code READINGTHEPAST30 at checkout, you will get 30% off of an annual subscription. Thanks again to History Hit for sponsoring this video. So, let's take a look at Hans Holbein the Younger's King Henry VIII. Hans Holbein the Younger was born in southern Germany in around 1497 or 8. His father was another artist, also called Hans Holbein. Perhaps unsurprisingly, as he was the older one, he is known to history as Hans Holbein the Elder. The surviving evidence points to the younger Holbein moving to live and work in Basel in Switzerland by 1515. Now, from this point in the video, I am going to be referring to this younger Holbein as just Holbein, because we aren't going to be looking at either his father or brother. In 1526, Holbein travelled to England, and he soon obtained a place in King Henry VIII's service. Holbein provided some decorative embellishments for court entertainments which took place at Greenwich in 1527. And during this first period in England, Holbein was also commissioned to paint prominent people, such as Sir Henry Guildford and his wife, and also Sir Thomas More. Holbein painted More for both an individual portrait and also for a now lost group portrait of More's household. Between 1528 and 1531, or perhaps early 1532, Holbein was back in Basel. However, he had returned to England by the end of 1532 at the latest, and at this point he had begun working for the royal family in England. Anne Boleyn commissioned him to make this table fountain in 1533. It served as the first New Year's gift that she would give to Henry as his wife and queen. Holbein would remain in royal service to King Henry VIII and his family for the rest of his life. Holbein died in 1543, most likely from the plague. But we are here to discuss a particular work that Holbein made during this second, indeed final period in England. It's this one, or at least some version of it. I would argue that it's very likely that if I asked you to think of King Henry VIII, if I asked you to conjure an image of him in your mind, that if we set aside the film and TV versions, this is going to be the one that springs to mind. In fact, if you search online for images of Henry VIII, this, or a version or detail of it, is going to be among the top results. What we are looking at here is a full-length portrait of King Henry VIII that comes from the workshop of Hans Holbein the Younger. This particular portrait is derived from the so-called Whitehall mural. The original Whitehall piece was painted onto the wall in one of the staterooms of the Palace of Whitehall. That palace had once belonged to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, at which time it was better known as York Place. After Wolsey's fall and then his death in 1529, York Place was seized by the Crown. It was subsequently renamed Whitehall. The Whitehall mural was commissioned in 1537. In the October of that year, Henry's third wife and queen, Jane Seymour, would give birth to Henry's longed-for son and heir, Edward. Just 12 days later, Jane would die due to complications following that birth. It has been suggested that the mural was commissioned to celebrate Henry and Jane's 1536 marriage, or perhaps her pregnancy. This would certainly chime with my understanding of this image, because I certainly think that it would have been commissioned and indeed likely completed before Edward's birth and thus Jane's subsequent death. I say this because I believe that Henry almost certainly would have had Edward, his legitimate son and heir, painted into this mural, if indeed he had been born by the time that it was finished. Henry and Jane stand at the forefront of this mural. Behind them, on a seemingly raised platform, are the parents of Henry VIII. We see Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Susan Foister has translated the text on the plinth in the middle of this mural to read as follows, quote, "If it pleases you to see the illustrious images of heroes, look on these. No picture ever bore greater. The great debate, competition, and great question is whether father or son is the victor, for both indeed were supreme. The former often overcame his enemies and the conflagrations of his country, and finally brought peace to its citizens. The son, born indeed for greater things, removed the unworthy from their altars and replaced them by upright men. The arrogance of popes has yielded to unerring virtue, and while Henry VIII holds the sceptre in his hand, religion is restored. And during his reign, the doctrines of God have begun to be held in his honour." The bottom section on this plinth points to this image being a later copy of the mural that was made in 1667. It was commissioned, we are told, by Charles II and made by Remigius van Liemput. And it is just as well that this copy was made, because a little over 30 years later, on the 4th of January 1698, Whitehall Palace was almost completely destroyed by a fire. In fact, the banqueting house was the only part of this palace to survive through to the present day. Holbein's mural on the wall of this palace, featuring his full-length portrait of King Henry VIII, was also lost in this fire. This full-length portrait is contemporaneous with the mural. However, this one is attributed to the workshop of Hans Holbein the Younger rather than to the man himself. The unknown artist who was behind this portrait was, though, clearly familiar with both the mural and also likely had access to Holbein's sketches and plans for it. What we have here is a copy of Holbein's Henry. It's a copy made by a talented contemporary of Holbein's, an individual who was very familiar with the original mural and also with the artist who made it. The viewer encounters King Henry VIII in an opulent scene. Behind him, we see palatial architectural features, in addition to there being a damask curtain. On the walls, the green would have been malachite, while the purple-red would have been porphyry. Beneath his feet there is laid what Henry's contemporaries would most likely have referred to as a, quote, Turkey carpet. This is an import from the Islamic world, most likely from the Ottoman Empire or from Persia. These carpets were incredibly expensive, coveted, imported wares. A person encountering one of these carpets in Tudor England would be as likely to find it decorating the walls of a home or placed over a table as anything else. For it to be on the floor, something that could be trodden upon, is a mark of extreme opulence. But in addition to being a display of wealth, of taste, and of magnificence, carpets like this, especially when they are placed underfoot, connect the person who is standing upon them to the divine. Because there was a tradition in European Renaissance art of depicting religious figures, and in particular the Virgin and Child, with carpets just like this one beneath their feet. Henry stands on this carpet in fashionable duckbill or cow-mouth leather shoes. His feet are positioned wide apart. This allows him to take up space. It is a physically imposing sight for the viewer to see. In this stance, he also looks sturdy, unshakable. Is there perhaps in this the intimation that Henry's rule, his nation, indeed his dynasty, is something that is equally as steadfast? Another thing that this wide stance allows for is for the king's shapely calves to be shown off in his tight-fitting stockings or hose. There are many medieval and early modern accounts that refer to a man's calves as something that affected his perceived attractiveness. In the Tudor period, the more muscular the calf, the better. It is possible that some men who perhaps felt they were lacking in the calf department may have used padding to stuff their stockings and thus be perceived as being more attractive. The blue and gold band around Henry's left leg is his garter from the Order of the Garter. We can just see the y pense of the On y soit qui mal y pense of that order's motto. Beneath his clothing and against his skin, the king is wearing the expected white undershirt. Of course, in Henry's case, this is going to be the most luxurious version of this kind of undershirt that money can buy. We can see the collar and the cuffs of this undershirt at the king's neck and wrists. It is also possible that this undershirt has been pulled or puffed through the slashes in the king's doublet. However, it may also be that doublets were somehow pre-lined with this cloth, something that either was or replicated the cloth of undershirts, and so that way when this garment went on, it was already perfectly pre-puffed and in place. The undershirt is vital because this is the item of clothing that would be laundered. Indeed, in many cases, washing the outer garments would have been difficult, if not impossible, due to the materials that were used for them. The next layer, sitting on top of this undershirt, is a doublet, which appears to be made of silk, or perhaps more likely, cloth of silver. In either case, these would be extraordinarily expensive imported fabrics. Adding further to this cost is the fact that this already expensive fabric has then been embellished further. We can see that blackwork embroidery is a feature, and also that jewels have been attached. These jewels are known as ouches, and they are made up of gold and most likely balas rubies. On top of the doublet is a matching jerkin with a deep U-shaped neckline. We have a codpiece which also matches the fabric, and that is shown to be bulging from the opening in the jerkin. A note on codpieces. While their size was almost certainly an aggressive assertion about the particular wearer's masculinity and virility, no one, and I mean no one, is filling their codpiece with themselves. And that's principally because the effort of remaining tumesced all day is probably going to result in unconsciousness, and if not, it's going to result at the very least in a great deal of discomfort. No one is doing that. But in terms of function, codpieces essentially do the same job as a fly in trousers. Over time, they evolved into this padded flap that would be secured to the wearer's outfits with points or laces. They were secured in such a manner that they could be untied whenever the wearer wanted to relieve themselves. There is, however, also a suggestion that some codpieces might have been produced with a space that was left next to the body. This space was intended to be used to store valuables in a similar way to a pocket or a purse. Perhaps it was even viewed as a safe place to store the family jewels. On top of these garments is a red silk velvet coat, with its padded shoulders to make Henry look broader, and thus more powerful, physically imposing and masculine. This coat has been embellished with gold embroidery and lined with sable fur. So once again, we are seeing heavily worked, expensive, imported materials on display. Henry wears a thick gold chain that is encrusted with pearls, also with diamonds. I am referring to the black stones that are visible, and I say these are diamonds because it has been established that Renaissance artists would paint diamonds as black. As for the red gems we are seeing, they are most likely ballast rubies. Hanging beneath this chain is an ornately worked gold medallion. The medallion is on a chain of its own that has been decorated with the repeating letter H. At the centre of this medallion is a diamond. Henry's hands, replete with gold rings featuring diamonds and likely once again ballast rubies, are shown gripping things. His right hand holds a glove, while his left hand clutches the golden chain securing his dagger. I think we're being shown a king that is ready to go about his business, someone who is fully willing and able to defend both his nation and his own rights, even if that requires violence. Upon his head, this king wears a black bonnet that has been decorated with gold detailing, with pearls, diamonds, and an ostrich feather. So what are we being shown here? What is this portrait trying to tell us? Well, I see it as a kind of proclamation, if you will. It's designed to announce Henry's wealth, his power, his masculinity, and I think in large part his continual sexual potency. No need to worry about that. All of these fine qualities and attributes are matched only by the wealth and power of Henry's nation. This is a king who has tapped into the overseas trading networks, that much is clear, because that is how he's got these materials, the ones that he has used to dress and indeed surround himself with such a high degree of magnificence. Henry, we are being told, is a powerful, unshakable king, and that appears to be being shown both literally and figuratively. I mean, frankly, England is lucky to have him. All the other heads of state, or indeed potential domestic troublemakers, should therefore think twice, and then think some more before they even attempt to mess with him. I think it's worth pointing out that multiple copies of this image were made. Various members of the nobility had their own expensive painted versions of it produced, and doing this is a great way to announce your loyalty. It's going to be a vital addition to any household that is, shall we say, fortunate enough to host a royal visit. And so, for all those who spent their time in royal or noble residences, they're going to have many opportunities to find themselves, shall we say, confronted by this. And so, this portrait's message would, therefore, reach numerous eyes. And yet, 1537, which is the year that the original mural this painting was based on, were made, 1537 is not quite the sure and stable time that this painting appears to be making out. In the preceding years, Henry had broken with Rome. This enabled him to take charge of the national church of his country and also of its wealth. But doing this left his nation and his rule vulnerable. It risked there being a potential invasion by any European power who was set on making holy war in the name of the Roman Catholic faith. Additionally, it would certainly have made any loyal Roman Catholic nation much less willing to make a treaty or do a deal with England. And so, at least in some ways, England was cast adrift from much of mainland Europe. On top of this, King Henry VIII's treatment of the Holy Roman Emperor's aunt, Catherine of Aragon, is something that would only have served to inflame matters. The changes to faith in England also caused unrest there at home. A particular example of this being the Pilgrimage of Grace, which I have made a video on that I will leave linked. The Pilgrimage of Grace represented, I think, one of the riskier moments in all of Henry's rule. This uprising had begun towards the end of 1536, but there had been another outbreak of it at the start of 1537. On top of this, there were some scandalous executions which drew the comment and indeed the horror of much of Christendom. Perhaps the most shocking was the execution of that famed scholar Sir Thomas More in 1535. The following year, 1536, would not go well for Henry personally either. There had, perhaps at the start, been reason for Henry to breathe a sigh of relief, following the death of Catherine of Aragon on the 7th of January. Surely we can understand how he might have thought that any threat from Catherine's nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, would be somewhat nullified as they now had no surviving rival who was claiming to be Henry's wife and queen. However, any relief that Henry may have felt on this account would soon be overshadowed, when later that month he was pretty seriously injured in a jousting accident. It seems that on this occasion an ulcer on his leg opened up, and according to reports or accounts, this wound would never heal up. Instead, for the rest of Henry's life, it would cause him a great deal of pain. It would smell pretty bad, and it also disfigured his legs. The legs that he had once been so proud of, that were viewed as being such an important mark of male attractiveness. Besides this, his health would never really recover, and his inability to move as much, in part I think due to the pain he was in, no doubt contributed to the weight gain that was a feature of his final years. To compound matters further, Anne Boleyn had a miscarriage not long after this jousting accident. It is reported that the baby she was carrying was a male. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested. She was accused of treason. It was also alleged that she had been unfaithful to Henry with a number of men at court. Henry was, therefore, according to the terminology of his day, a cuckold. And being called a cuckold was something that was worthy of being ashamed of at that time. The man was supposed to be the head of his household. If a man could not control his wife, how could he be expected to control his household? When that man was a king, his wife a queen, what on earth did that mean for his country? On the 17th of May, 5 men, including Anne's own brother George, were executed following their conviction for these crimes. Anne was beheaded 2 days later, on the 19th of May. But that's not all, because the great display of wealth and affluence that we see here is somewhat undercut by the fact that Henry was a spendthrift. Indeed, in the decade after this portrait was made, in the 1540s, the so-called Great Debasement would commence. During this period, the English coin would be so devalued that any trust in it, either at home or abroad, was utterly despoiled. Indeed, perhaps the only high point of 1537 was the pregnancy of Henry's third wife and queen, Jane Seymour. Finally, the king would get his surviving son and heir. But the process would cost Jane her life. It seems then that even this silver lining of 1537 had a rather large cloud. This portrait then, as was so often the case, is a fantasy, a deception, a work of propaganda. Is it the case that the only true element in it is Henry's threatening dominance? That is, I think, certainly something that had real-world validity. But there's another word for threatening dominance, and that's tyranny. And tyranny is something that no king would look to brag about. As for the rest of the narrative, I have to wonder if anyone, apart from maybe Henry himself, actually bought any part of it. So, what do you think of this portrait, its origins and its overall message? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comment section underneath this video. Perhaps it's worth mentioning that the comment section is also a great place to drop an emoji, or as we have now started to call them, a social glyph. Any and all engagement with this video helps to boost it through the algorithm, which in turn helps to boost my channel. And so if you could, I would be really grateful. Additionally, you can find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to all the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box so that you can follow me over on some or all of those. And if you do so, we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with some friends? In fact, if you like my channel, you could let your pals know about that too, and that way you'll just have more people to talk about history with in real life. Please also let me know that you liked this video by hitting the thumbs up. Do subscribe to the channel. If you think you're subscribed, now's an ideal time just to have a little check to make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will. And while you're there, checking, subscribing, resubscribing, why not hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button, and then when you do that, hit all in the drop down that will appear, and that way, allegedly, maybe sometimes, YouTube might tell you when I've next uploaded. For some people, it has been working. Either way, I hope that you're going to have a great day whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.